Thank you. Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you so much for this wonderful invitation to come here. I've really always wanted to come to the Arctic Circle, and to be able to fulfill that dream tonight is very special. But it really is a great honor to get to come and talk to, in the first instance, such a wonderful center that I'm so excited to watch develop and grow, and I think has such tremendous promise. The Kinder Forum on Constitutional Democracy. And I love Justin's description of his intentions for tonight, including the reception that we just had to bring together people from across disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, because it's such an important part of the academic life, of the intellectual life of a great university. And so, Justin, I encourage you to only continue that. We need to join forces, certainly in the world that we live in today. And what you do at this center and what you do as humanities and social science scholars is really at the heart of a university, but especially of a great public university. And training citizens, preparing people for the kinds of thinking and the kinds of discourse that are essential for a healthy democracy is really what a great public university does. So thank you, Justin, for your efforts to build this program, and I wish you the best of luck. So we live in the formulation of Charles Taylor in a secular age. That doesn't mean that faith is impossible or that religion is in decline, but that the framing assumptions of the public culture that we live in no longer explicitly presupposes God. Secularity, in this sense, is what Charles Taylor defines as a matter of the whole context of understanding in which our moral, spiritual, or religious experience and search takes place, including the largely unfocused background of this experience and its search. It's pre-ontology, to use a Heideggerian term. That's the last Heideggerian term we'll use all night. So what does he mean by that? He means that today is February 19th of 2015 of the Common Era, an ordering of time that's erected on Christian foundations, but from which public culture has subsequently tried to erase the theistic traces. To take another example, it really wasn't so long ago, well within my own lifetime, that we used to pray over the loudspeaker before football games at the University of Oklahoma. Now, I know that at the University of Missouri, you must think that the heavenly armies are always on our side. That may have had something to do with changing conferences, I'm not sure. But what it really means is that this seems quaint to us today, increasingly quaint and distant. That somehow a public culture of people of all different kinds of background of Baptist could come together, mostly Baptist, in sort of different states of sobriety, 85,000 of them, and invoke the deity before a sporting event. What's gone are the kind of assumptions that let that happen, and that's what Taylor means by a secular age. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche was the prophet who sensed the arrival of this age. Although in his book, The Gay Science, where he famously announced the death of God, he warned that this prodigious event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Its full realization, in other words, would unravel in future time, and its consequences would be unsettling. He wrote in The Twilight of the Idols, "When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident," he wrote. It's precisely the secularization of culture predicted by Nietzsche that has generated such anxiety in recent years about the origin and grounds of what was once so optimistically called, in the American Declaration of Independence, a self-evident truth, namely natural or human rights. For Nietzsche, human rights were an abominable lie, foisted by the weak on the strong. They represented the culmination of what he called a slave revolt in morality, by which Christianity overthrew the supposedly beautiful and life-embracing ethics of the pagan world. He wrote, "Such phantoms as the dignity of man, the dignity of labor, are the needy products of slavedom hiding from itself. Now the slave must vainly scrape through from one day to another with its transparent lies, recognizable to everyone of deeper insight, like Nietzsche, such as the alleged equal rights of all, or the so-called fundamental rights of man, or the dignity of labor. For Nietzsche, humanity bore no inherent dignity. Quote, man in himself, the absolute man, possesses neither dignity, nor rights, nor duties." In the words of Michael Rosen, Nietzsche's extraordinary polemic sets in relief how far the concept of dignity had developed in his day into an amalgam of humanist, liberal, Christian, socialist, and Kantian ideas, all of which Nietzsche loathed. So human dignity sort of combined everything that he stood against. Now, his challenge to moral foundationalism remains very much with us. Human rights occupy a paradoxical place in our world. On the one hand, they're the foundation of global moral order, the baseline of shared civilizational norms. Can you be against human rights? Well, you can be against them, but it makes you a contrarian or a crackpot. On the other hand, it's hard to say precisely what they are, where they come from, and why we have to believe in them. These open questions have made human rights a hot topic in the academy. In fact, human rights anxiety probably has at least 3 different sources. One is the uncertainties and instabilities of a multipolar international order, without the perilous, if reassuring, opposition between liberalism and communism. A second is the triumph of Kantianism, Immanuel Kant's philosophy, as the dominant spirit of contemporary liberalism. Behind John Rawls, Martha Nussbaum, Jürgen Habermas, and others, the stars of pragmatism and utilitarianism have faded, as Kant's cosmopolitan deontology has ascended. If rights are essentially beneficial or pragmatic, justifying them is a relatively simpler matter than if they are rules or duties whose recognition is somehow a foundational precondition of justice. And a closely related phenomenon is the progress of secularization. Against a background where theistic presumptions can't be invoked, what basis can justify claims as strong and unconditional as those implicit in the architecture of human rights? Where do rights come from? That question, as any worthy political question, requires attention to history. I have to say that because I'm a historian. But the past of human rights doesn't limit or exhaust or determine the possible justifications of human rights that we can offer today. Human rights aren't an inheritance whose lineage we have to identify in order to determine their fixed inner character. At the same time, a good genealogy of human rights is of more than antiquarian interest. The historian of human rights isn't just like a bored retiree trying to fill in an ancestry table for the sake of it. This is high-stakes history that promises to reveal features of the logic of rights that otherwise remain hidden. High-stakes history is usually contentious, and the search for the origins of rights has generated keen and spirited interest. To speak in understatement, there's disagreement about where we should look for the true origins of rights. There are short chronologies that emphasize the radical novelty of the 20th century, either in post-war developments that led to the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, or the birth of human rights activism in the 1970s. There are long chronologies that look to a Judeo-Christian heritage for the genesis of human rights. In between, almost any and every century has an advocate at one point or another. Aristotle, Ulpian, the canon lawyers of the late Middle Ages, William of Ockham, Pico della Mirandola, Grotius, Locke, and any number of Enlightenment figures have been portrayed as pioneers of human rights. I've seen more organized debates about the greatest rock and roll band of all time. Let me try and tidy up the discussion in that tried and true fashion by being sweepingly dismissive of whole swaths of scholarship that I find less than fruitful. Distracting attention has been devoted to the question of whether there were subjective rights in antiquity. There were, plain and simple. Roman law pervasively assumes that individuals can be the bearers of something we can recognize as rights. Of course, these weren't human rights, but the fact that Roman law is fully familiar with legal rights vested in the individual makes the innovations that have sometimes been imputed to these others far less interesting. If that doesn't mean much to you, don't worry about it. He who has ears, let him hear. It's kind of inside baseball there. What's left is, I think, the really genuinely interesting question that I'd like to pose of how to account for Enlightenment norms and proclamations of human rights. Here's the critical historical question. Were human rights born in the space opened by the secular motion away from the Christian inheritance? Or were human rights a secularization of Christian norms? In different ways, Jonathan Israel, Tom LaCour, Lynn Hunt, do we see the Enlightenment as a moment of novelty, of liberation from the superstitions of the past? Or instead, with someone like Charles Taylor, is the Enlightenment something more like a secularization of values whose origin lay in theistic times? On this latter view, the symbol of the Enlightenment, the idea that the Enlightenment is a secularization of a pre-existing liberalism, the symbol of the Enlightenment might be the Thomas Jefferson Bible. I bring that up because I'm at a place with a mysterious kinship that I don't fully understand with Thomas Jefferson, in which the author of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, literally took the Bible and took a razor and cut out the miracles, just leaving the kind of nice narrative and teaching parts. On this view, Enlightenment sexual morality is a secular version of Christian morality, scrubbed of superstition, but still represents the soul of Enlightenment liberalism. This latter view was certainly Nietzsche's view, even if it led him to reject the existence of human rights with prejudice. But it's a view that hasn't been especially patiently or even convincingly demonstrated. And it's been easy for those who favor the modern origins of rights, who say they're new in the Enlightenment or in the 20th century, to point to the absence of human rights in the pre-modern political charters or political writings. In fact, just last week, this is very much a live issue, in a review of Larry Siedentop's Inventing the Individual, Sam Moyne, who's one of the arch modernists, threw down the gauntlet against anyone who claims the origins of rights for the deep past. He wrote, quote, "There is a major difficulty for anyone, including Siedentop, who tells a Christian story of liberalism's origins. They must explain how, against its original purposes, the gospel's message was brought down to earth, applied right now to radically new aims and institutions that Jesus and Paul would not have accepted. Such an explanation hasn't been offered, he claims, by anyone for that matter." It's my claim tonight that we can find the origins of human rights logic in the ancient world, and that we can locate its first expressions at a particular moment in time when Christianity first became a majority religion, accepted in the public sphere. I can't come tonight and tell you that I found anything as neat or clear as a lost declaration of human rights. Great revolutions in moral logic are usually not neat and clear. What I propose is that in the encounter between Christianity and the world in late antiquity, we find for the first time the constituent elements of rights logic in the public sphere. The logic of human rights depends on the confluence of two essential characteristics. First, their universal or egalitarian nature. And second, their belief in the inherent dignity of the human being. Human rights are rights that individuals have just by virtue of being human, being in the human race, not by virtue of individual characteristics so that I merit these because of the kind of person that I am, or by membership in a particular community. They aren't civil or constitutional rights as such. Moreover, these rights are anchored in the intrinsic and even incomparable worthiness of the human being. On this view, the basic structure of human rights is Kantian, in the sense of being cosmopolitan and grounded in the incomparable dignity of human moral reasoning. In his groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals, Kant famously wrote, quote, "In the kingdom of ends, everything has either a value or a dignity. Whatever has a value can be replaced by something else which is equivalent. Whatever, on the other hand, is above all value, and therefore admits of no equivalent, has a dignity. Now, morality is the condition under which alone a rational being can be an end in and of himself, since by this alone is it possible that he should be a legislating member in the kingdom of ends. Thus morality, and humanity is capable of it, is that which alone has dignity." The search for the origins of rights, on this view, is the search for the means by which, in the moment when ideas of cosmopolitanism and dignity began to flow together to make claims about the kinds of respect that were due to the human person as such. That moment, I argue, is late antiquity, in the Roman Empire after the Constantinian Revolution. These ideas didn't exist in conjunction in Greco-Roman antiquity. Now, a form of cosmopolitanism did emerge in some philosophical circles long before the Christian gospel. The very word cosmopolitan, of course, means citizen of the world. It's a Greek word, citizen, polites, of the world, cosmou, of the cosmos. It was coined by the cynic Diogenes, who was asked where he came from and said, "I'm a citizen of the world. Like, I didn't come from this polis or that polis. I came from the entire world. I belong to the entire order." The term and the idea of a cosmopolitan gained currency in Stoic philosophy. In fact, it would be appropriate to see the cosmopolitan impulses of ancient philosophy in terms of a broader pattern of axial age universalism. What Karl Jaspers first identified as the axial age, a transitional phase in human history in the middle of the first millennium BC, when many global cultures developed similar ideas, including a consciousness of humanity as such. Although it came at its sunset, Christianity was an axial age religion, maybe even the axial age religion par excellence, especially in its Pauline and Lucan insistence on the incorporation of all nations into the salvation of God. This is one of the really central ideas of Paul. There isn't Jew or Greek in Jesus Christ. Axial age universalism, we could concede, was a step towards the possibility of human rights. Some, like Martha Nussbaum, have argued that Kant's cosmopolitanism was a revivification of Stoic cosmopolitanism. And certainly the Stoics were a strong influence on Enlightenment liberalism, and Kant in particular. But when Nussbaum claims that Kant found in the Stoics, the ancient Stoics, the idea that, quote, each and every human being, just in virtue of being rational and moral, has boundless worth, it attributes a notion of worthiness to Stoic anthropology that is plainly missing in the ancient authors, and instead represents a heightened sense of human dignity that is rather a Christian phenomenon. And if you look at her very good paper on Kant and Stoic cosmopolitanism, right at that point she stops using footnotes because she can't point to any ancient text that quite says that. Take Cicero, an influential conduit of Stoic ideas. In his recent exploration of the history of dignity, Michael Rosen attributes Cicero, as an avatar of Stoic universalism, a leading place in the development of Western ideas about human dignity. Indeed, Cicero does argue that human nature is something better, more worthy than animal nature, and is not worthy of moral disillusion, that humans should behave morally because they're humans and have reason. He writes, "We have been allotted by nature with two forms of personhood. One of these is common to all humanity. It is grounded in the fact that all participate in the use of reason. It sets us above the beasts, and it is whence all that is honorable and proper derive. The other form of personhood is the individuality that each has been granted. For example, the great differences that exist in our physical endowments." So Cicero is evincing a kind of moral egalitarianism. All humans are endowed with the faculty of reason. But he nowhere uses the language, the dignity of man, nor does he impute dignitas to every human being. Elsewhere, Cicero advised that beneficence be dispensed with great care, that you treat people with great care, allotting in proportion to the worthiness of the recipient, pro dignitate, something that some people have more of than another. He has a very ordinary Roman understanding of dignitas. The Latin noun derives from the adjective dignus, which means worthy, appropriate, or merited. Dignitas is worthiness. Dignitas generally means high worth. In the Roman world, it was one's worthiness. In a steeply graded and hierarchical society, it was not an official social rank, but an attribute of high-ranking people. The generic sense of worthiness was never lost, and none of the ancient Stoics ever argued that all humans were of high worthiness or rank. In the mind of Seneca, one of the most important Stoics, a Roman writer of the 1st century, dignitas was still very much on a sliding scale. He said there should be a proportion between persons and their dignities. He said it's easier to grow in dignity than to start. And even while, like Cicero, accepting the universal moral potential of all humans, Seneca underscores that it was a highly variable trait. Although in other matters there are vast differences of dignity and nobility, virtue is open to all. She disdains no one who judges himself worthy of the exercise of virtue. Now, relative to the parochial politics of the Greek and Roman worlds, where the individual's duties and entitlements were eminent within the locked circle of the community, the polis, Stoic cosmopolitanism took a firm step towards the idea of human rights. But we look in vain for the constituent ingredients of both cosmopolitanism and dignity. Taking up Moyne's challenge, I think we can discover how the gospel message was brought down to earth in the period when Christianity became illicit and gradually a majority religion. The Christian leaders in the vanguard of mass conversion were forced to confront the world, no longer as a persecuted minority facing an imperial power in the grip of cosmic evil, but as a triumphant majority in which the world, with its principalities and powers, seemed to be becoming an instrument of salvation. Let's dispel in advance that we will find in late antiquity any arguments for iura humana, or human rights, issuing from the mouths of Christian revolutionaries. In other words, we shouldn't expect to find formal human rights claims. Instead, we find the constituent elements of Kantian rights, universalism and dignity, the view that each human is the bearer of incomparable worth, underlying new kinds of claims about the duties and entitlements we have just by virtue of being human. The conversion of Constantine didn't usher in an era of glorious Christian Kantianism, but we do find meaningful eruptions of the logic of human rights into a world where they were totally foreign. My approach is probably closest in the way it construes history to that of Nicholas Walterstorff, who also argues for the essentially Christian origins and theistic nature of rights claims. His focus is on the development of the intellectual grounds for rights claims. So his chapters on late antiquity really are only about Augustine. He argues that the place of love and compassion for others in Augustine's philosophy goes beyond the care for the self that could be grounded in ancient philosophies. For Walterstorff, Augustinian love destroyed the boundaries of ancient philosophy, in which the virtuous care for others was always and ultimately a form of care for one's own moral self, not for the other in and of him or herself. Christian love, in Augustine's formulation, was grounded in genuine regard for other. That's Walter Stroeff's argument. And I think this reconstruction is compatible with the story I tell. But it's certainly looking for the place of rights in a different location. Let's look instead at Christian reactions to real, concrete structures of experience, to see how new concepts of the dignity of humanity appeared in the eyes of the first generations of Christian leadership. Stone by stone, as the triumphant church emerged into the light of day, its leaders looked on a community no longer steeled against the world, but somehow permeated by it. And some of the practices and structures of that world began to appear incompatible with the first principles of the gospel. Take the problem of slavery as a first example. The problem of slavery always provides a powerful lens into the ideological structure of a social and political regime. Treating humans as property inherently denies them access to social honor and bonds of kinship, is an exclusionary practice inflicted on symbolic outsiders. Slavery has been accepted in most of human history. We are the heirs of that aberrant historical movement called abolitionism. In the grand sweep of history, in fact, few societies have been so squarely constructed on the institution of slavery as were ancient Greece and Rome. Christian scripture provided ample resources for the justification, or at least the accommodation of slavery. It's been argued that, quote, the scriptural core of Christianity provided no articulate program of social reform and little impetus to change on the question of slavery. The command that slaves should obey their masters in the flesh with fear and trembling allowed Christianity to absorb the slave system with a minimum of inconvenience. That was from my first book. So I think that for the most part, Christianity could get along with slavery in the ancient world. But against that dim news, there is a document that begins to jut out against the horizon. A homily on Ecclesiastes by the 4th century Greek father of the church, Gregory of Nyssa. To appreciate the extraordinary rupture presented in this sermon, recall that we have no extant criticisms of slavery as an institution from the entire ancient world. We have no opposition to slavery as an institution before these words. Gregory was part of a remarkable generation of post-Constantinian Christianity that struggled to consolidate orthodoxy in the age of Christian legitimacy. His generation represented, for the first time in history, the children of the Greek gentry, raised in the faith, but also with access to the highest levels of education available in the ancient world. Gregory, his brother Basil of Caesarea, their companion Gregory of Nazianzus, attended school in Athens, and their horizons were truly imperial. At the same time, they led the church during precisely the moment when Christianity probably became something like a majority religion. They were, in the phrase of Susanna Elm, sons of Hellenism, fathers of the church. They stood between the radicalism of the early church and an establishment outlook that was quickly gathering its balance. Out of this mixture, though, erupted one of the great bursts of creative social thought in history. Gregory wrote, "If a man makes that which truly belongs to God into his own private property, by allotting himself sovereignty over his own race, and thinks himself the master of men and women, what could follow but an arrogance exceeding all nature from the one who sees himself as something other than the ones who are ruled?" Slave ownership was unjust, he wrote, because it violated the free nature of humans. Quote, "Do you condemn man to slavery, whose nature is free and autonomous?" For an ancient historian, this is a remarkable statement. No ancient authority had invoked the free nature of human beings as an argument against institutional slavery. Gregory proceeded to attack slavery by questioning, philosophically, the paradigmatic act of the slave system, the slave sale. With deep insight, he asked, how could a human being, the rational creation of God, be given a price? What can have the same market value as human nature? Quote, "How much does rationality cost? How many obols, coins, for the image of God? How many staters did you get for selling the God-formed man?" Gregory offers a logic that was entirely novel in the ancient world, but one that would reverberate in later centuries with tremendous consequence: the incommensurability of some values. He argues that the value of human nature, specifically the rational nature of man created in the image of God, couldn't be expressed in units of exchange value. Human nature was incomparably worthy. Quote, "For he who knew human nature said that the entire cosmos was not worthy to be exchanged for the soul of a man." His vision of humanity was deeply stamped by his interpretation of Genesis and a profound reflection on the significance of humanity as a creation in the image of God. Although his view of human dignity was fundamentally grounded in a theological framework, he is incomparably closer to Kant than any thinker before him, or for a long time after. Why do these soaring, if futile, words of a Christian theologian matter? I think it's no small distinction to be the earliest human to have left an argument for the basic injustice of slavery, though Gregory's contribution is little appreciated, if not mostly forgotten today. What's all the more remarkable is that Gregory looked past the obvious surface rationalizations for slavery that were abundantly available, even in Christian scripture, to develop a philosophically coherent account of human nature grounded in Christian values. And those values were firmly centered on universal dignity. Slavery is just one ideologically rich side of confrontation between the Christian gospel and the world in late antiquity. A second, less obvious but equally important, centers on practices of sexual coercion. It's less obvious in part because the Greeks and Romans, in their culture, sexual coercion wasn't even a problem. Christian ideology first made it possible to identify clearly the mechanics of force in the ancient sexual economy. Sheer violence, institutional and personal, was integral to ancient sexual cultures. Slaves and prostitutes, anyone who stood outside the circle of legitimate social reproduction, were vulnerable, and their vulnerability became the object of systemic exploitation. It's hard for us to imagine the centrality of slaves, and especially prostitutes, in the sexual world of the Roman Empire. The early Christians certainly had a sharp and distinctive ideal of sexual morality. It set Christians apart from mainstream culture. Indeed, the Christians placed far greater emphasis on sexual rigor than the philosophical schools of antiquity. Given the high stakes that Christians placed on sexual ethics, it's surprising that the Christian texts of the first 3 centuries fail to address the problem of sexual coercion. For 3 centuries, the church was a persecuted subculture, set apart from society, not answerable to the order of the world. But in the aftermath of Constantine's conversion, as the church became a majority institution, it was confronted at a deeper level with the contradictions between its morality and the structure of the society that it inhabited. Christian sexual morality collided with the systemic exploitation of men and women who lacked access to social honor by virtue of their station in life. The first stirrings of a totally new consciousness appear in the sermons of Gregory of Nyssa's brother, Basil of Caesarea. He preached, "If you ask why the life of the sinner is long, but the days of the just man are cut short, why the wicked prosper and the good are oppressed, why the child is snatched away before his time, where war comes from, why ships wreck, why the earth shakes and the water floods or drought strikes, why this man is a slave and this man free, the difference is greater among those who commit sin and those who are righteous. For while the slave woman who was sold to a pimp is in sin by necessity, she who happens to belong to a well-born mistress was raised with sexual modesty. And on this account, the one is shown mercy, and the other contemned." Here, for the first time, in a passage searching the mysterious dispensation of God, we find a clear statement that humans lacking volition, lacking control over themselves, couldn't be held responsible for the acts to which they were subjected. This wasn't a passing thought. In fact, it grows in his own writings and reverberates over the next generations. What's all the more remarkable is that the novel concern for the fate of women forced into prostitution had a direct political consequence. Unlike Gregory's attack on slavery, which disappeared into the wind, Basil's solicitude for the victims of sexual exploitation resulted in proactive imperial legislation to eliminate the practice. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II issued a decree: "We cannot suffer for pimps, fathers, and slave owners who impose the necessity of sinning on their daughters or slave women to enjoy the right of power over them, nor to indulge freely in such crime. It pleases us that these men are subjected to such disdain that they may not be able to benefit from the right of power, nor anything be thus acquired by them. It is to be granted to the slaves and daughters and others who have hired themselves out on account of their poverty to be relieved of the necessity of this misery. If the pimp shall think these women are to be urged on or impose the necessity of sin on those who are unwilling, they will lose not only that power, but they will be prescribed by exile to the public mines, which is less of a punishment than that of a woman who is seized by a pimp and compelled to endure the filth of an intercourse that she did not will." The translation of Christian ideology into Roman law could hardly be clearer. The necessity of sinning is a term totally alien to Roman law. The law represents an unprecedented use of the state's power. For the first time, those whose bodies lacked any familial or civic claim to sexual honor received the protection of the state, simply by virtue of their human dignity. At its core, this campaign is an expression of a new model of human solidarity. the campaign brought the most morally invisible bodies inside the horizons of public care. The state could no longer remain absolutely indifferent to the exploitation of those bodies and of Christian ideas of dignity. It could be focused on the problem of poverty. On no other social issue did the Christian gospel provide such complete and unambiguous marching orders. Love for the poor was a central tenet of Christian social ideology. Peter Brown's wonderful new book, Through the Eye of a Needle, captures the freshness and significance of Christian responses to poverty in late antiquity. Greco-Roman pre-Christian models of wealth were fundamentally civic. Public systems of property distribution were organized around the body of citizens. Civic ergotism made powerful ideological claims on elite wealth. Greek and Roman aristocrats were expected to sponsor games and festivals, to build buildings and monuments, to share their abundance in the public sphere. But the poor simply didn't exist as a social category within the machinery of ancient gift-giving. Charity per se was not an articulate motivation for the distribution of beneficence. The Christian response to poverty was broad and varied, and it didn't have to wait for Constantine's vision. But once again, the period of late antiquity proved crucial for the development of Christianity as a public ideology. The Christian response to poverty, more immediately than any other aspect of the gospel, made corporate humanity, rather than the network of citizens, the basic model of human solidarity. What I would emphasize are the distinct philosophical foundations of this model. Christian responses to poverty were firmly anchored in beliefs about dignity. In a brilliant paper, Susan Holman recognized that the late antique Christian response to poverty foreshadowed an entirely new model of human entitlements. She wrote, in addition to their identity as kin, the needy are constructed as heavenly citizens and entitled to civic justice by virtue of their identity as bearers of the divine image. Consequently, they are entitled to patronage. In modern language, they have rights, ultimately by virtue of their relationship to God the Creator, who has given them both their human nature and membership in the civic community known as the Kingdom of Heaven. Once again, we discover the most articulate voices and definitive actions among the Cappadocian Fathers. According to Gregory of Nazianzus, Christians should act with, quote, the original equality of rights, not the subsequent inequity, in mind. Invoking the word isonomia, Gregory gestured towards a rich, ancient value, equality or quality of rights, that had underwritten the most egalitarian impulses even of Greek democracy. But Gregory could ground his vision of equality in divine intentions. The divisions between wealth and poverty, like those between freedom and slavery, were not part of the original creation, but rather evils that attended only a fallen humanity. Christians should recognize this fact in this world and act accordingly. Quote, imitate the egalitarian justice of God, and there will be no poor man. Gregory urged his listeners to pay heed to those exposed to the elements by their poverty, quote, tormented by biting cold and rain and blasts of wind. Their suffering was an affront to human solidarity. Quote, this is how they suffer, and in fact far more wretchedly than I've indicated. These are brothers in God, whether you like it or not, whose share in nature is the same as ours, who are formed of the same clay from the time of our first creation. More importantly, who have the same portion of the image of God just as we do, and who keep it perhaps better, wasted though their bodies may be. The parable of the Good Samaritan was a standing challenge, urging Christians to develop an unfailing moral antenna. Shall we neglect them, walk on by? The same logic is apparent in the preaching of Gregory of Nyssa. Quote, while all these revelries are proceeding in the houses of the rich, there are countless like Lazarus sitting at the gates. He confronted his congregants with the pitiful groans and gnashing of the poor. Quote, do not have contempt for those who lie prostrate as they were of no worth. Learn who they are, and you will discover their dignity, to axioma, literally their dignity. They will have put on the personhood, to prosopon, of our Savior. The one who loves humanity gave to them his own person to forestall those who lack sympathy or hate the poor, like those who display the images of the emperors against those who would use violence, so that their contempt is forestalled by the image of power. For Gregory, the worth of the poor was inherent in their humanity. The high rank of the poor was assured by the fact that God had lent them his own personhood. The respect due to the poor by virtue of their humanity was imperiled by the very experience of poverty and disease. Quote, you see a man who is transformed by this grievous afflictions into the form of an animal. His hands have been made into hooves or claws, leaving footprints on the man-made streets. Who can recognize that they are the prints a man has made, having passed along the way? A man whose form is upright looks to heaven, though by nature he has hands to do deeds. But the poor man's are turned to the earth and become bestial, and he is scarcely any more the rational being that is man. He has become more miserable than an irrational creature. For Gregory, poverty was an insult to the beauty of man's rational nature, symbolized by his upright posture that could look to heaven. The poor man, reduced to groveling in the dirt, had lost something of his essential humanity. Gregory's powerful images of savage poverty, in which humans are physically degraded, rests on a genuine aesthetics of human dignity. His social gospel was rooted not in a call for distributive justice as a matter of fairness, nor a necessary precondition for a certain kind of human freedom. Rather, its roots lie in a more basic sense that humans were degraded by the very experience of extreme want. In these sermons, we see with peculiar clarity that Christian leaders like Gregory would locate our most fundamental duties, not in the particular networks of kin or community where we find ourselves, but in the general obligations to respect the dignity of all human beings. In these texts of late antiquity, where we see the first generations of Christian leaders think through the implications of the gospel in a new order, we see the first beams of a new kind of human consciousness breaking over the horizon. Yet the period of late antiquity has been omitted from the story of human rights. This omission creates a blind spot precisely where a new notion of human dignity enters the stage as a public ideology and was forced to confront the blatant material affronts to human dignity, like slavery, sexual coercion, and poverty. For the first time, we encounter critiques based not on the moral damage done to the master or the rich man, but to the basic dignity of the victim. Restoring the period of late antiquity to the history of human rights is imperative for basic historical accuracy. It also seems to me to meet Moyne's challenge of describing how the gospel came down to earth. And this history reminds us that what to us seems unthinkable was once not even questioned. To return again to the beginning, Nietzsche was right, and deep inside Enlightenment liberalism lurks a heritage built on the slave revolt in morality that was Christianity. The Enlightenment declarations and charters gave legal and political form to values whose genealogy stretches back to the ancient world. This genealogy wouldn't have surprised in the least many of the great champions of human dignity in the 20th century, including Martin Luther King. He wrote, deeply rooted in our religious heritage is the conviction that every man is an heir to the legacy of dignity and worth. Our Judeo-Christian tradition refers to this inherent dignity of man in the biblical term, the image of God. Of course, the way we might feel about those words and their place in the public sphere would say a great deal about the progress of secularization, even in the half-century since King spoke them. Do they have all the quaintness of a prayer before a football game? We might individually and silently pray for the victory of our team or the realization of the dignity of all human beings. But how to ground strong beliefs about inherent dignity of all human beings in the secular terms of public reason remains as challenging as Nietzsche taunted us it would be. What I hope, though, is that all who are committed to the great project are also committed to get the history of rights right. And I hope we have contributed to that in some small way tonight.